Welcome to this internet presentation of furry psychology, also known as something furries can talk about that isn't Zootopia. I am Nuka, good-looking fellow, and I confess that I am in fact a furry. In addition to being a furry, I'm also a doctor, although not one of these kinds of doctors. In fact, I am what's known as a social psychologist. A social psychologist is a psychologist or a scientist who specifically studies human interaction and the environmental factors that influence human behavior, so how people and the environment around us can influence our behavior. In particular, I'm a social psychologist who studies the real-world effects that playing video games has on us. So when people play violent video games, how does that affect their real-world violence and aggression? But I also study much more broadly fantasy worlds. So when people become immersed in stories or games or books, what happens to them as they sort of allow themselves to treat this non-reality as though it were reality? How does that change how they think and how they think about the world around them? But perhaps most relevant to the talk today, I also study furries. I don't study furries alone. I study furries as part of the International Anthropomorhpic Research Project, a team of social scientists who, like myself, also study furries. This team of researchers includes Dr. Kathleen Gerbasi, who's a social psychologist working out of the Niagara County Community College in New York State. And despite not being a furry, Dr. Gerbasi does in fact have a fursuit. My colleague Dr. Stephen Rayson, who is down at Texas A&M University, Commerce, and despite not being a furry and not having a fursuit, does have a fursona. Carlin Bruegel is the only other furry on the team, so she does have a fursona, and she is a furry in her non-academic life. And finally, my colleague Dr. Sharon Roberts at the University of Waterloo is not a furry, but has had a multitude of fursonas, including her most recent one, which may in fact be a coconut. We at the International Anthropomorhpic Research Project do science. That means that we form hypotheses about furries. So we start off with some kind of idea that we want to test. We don't just walk around asking people questions for the fun of it. We're typically trying to answer some kind of question, whether this question came from our own observations, questions that other people have asked us, or searching through the psychological literature and looking at questions that come about from there. Typically, once we have these questions, we try to collect data to answer these questions. Usually this data comes from furries at conventions or from online surveys. So we go around and collect a lot of data on furries and some non-furries to be able to compare furries to. We take that data, all those numbers, and we crunch them, we analyze them in the hopes of coming up with some kind of conclusive answer to our initial question. And if all goes well, we end up publishing the results. Now, when I say we publish our results, there's a number of different places where this data ends up being published in the end. One place is on our research website, the Anthropomorhpic Research Project website. Another place that our data is made available is in peer-reviewed academic journals. So these are journals that psychologists or sociologists can go to and learn about furries and the research that we're doing. We say peer-reviewed because this is research that other scientists actually scrutinize themselves. So not every article or everything that's ever written gets published in these locations. Typically, other scientists have to look through it and be critical of it in order for it to be published. Finally, one of the places that our data winds up is in the media. Oftentimes, reporters or people will come to us asking us to provide some information about furries, typically in the aftermath of some calamity or some incident that furries were involved in. And people want to know, what are these furries? We're usually one of the first people they end up coming to. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking about data. So when we're talking about these results here, it's not a handful of furries that we talked to at a convention once, and it's not an anecdote or a story that we heard while talking to a furry at a bar or something like that. The data typically represents the collective sort of responses of hundreds of furries, in some cases thousands of furries, collected over the last 5 years. So we're talking about more than 24 studies, we're talking about thousands of pieces of data which have been published in more than 15 peer-reviewed scientific journals. So we're talking about a lot of data here. The shortened version of the data looks something like this. So enough talking about the data, enough talking about science in an abstract way. Let's get our hands dirty and actually get into the science itself. This is the plan for today. To start off by defining what we mean by a furry before talking about one of the things that most furries do, which is to create a persona. We'll also talk about some of the other things that furries do that sort of link or unite this fandom. We'll talk about some of the demographic composition of the fandom. So when you look around the fandom, what are we talking about in terms of age and gender and ethnic composition? We'll talk a little bit about the fandom and how it relates to other fandoms, similar to furries but also different from furries. And finally, answer that age-old question, are furries crazy? To start off, though, let's ask ourselves, what's a furry? It's important to know what a furry is before we start researching furries, because depending on the definition of a furry that we use, we're going to wind up with dramatically different results. Now, there are a number of definitions of furries that already exist out there that various people have come up with from time to time, but a lot of them are problematic from a research perspective. So, for example, one could define furries as people who like or do a certain behavior. So we could say that furries, for example, are people who wear fursuits. That's our definition of a furry. Well, if that's the case, what about all those furries who don't wear fursuits? There's no one behavior that we've been able to find so far that every single furry agrees with and says is part of something that they do. So necessarily, if we defined furry this way, we would be leaving out a lot of furries. What's more is that any behavior that we can come up with that all furries do, it's unlikely that other people who aren't furries don't also engage in this behavior. So for example, to use our fursuit again, there are people who wear fursuits or fursuit-like costumes that wouldn't call themselves furries. So if we define furries as people who wear costumes, we'd wind up with a lot of people who don't call themselves furries but would find themselves in our studies. So we can't use behaviors or attitudes as a definition of furry. What if we just say a furry is a certain type of person? Or if we could give people a personality test or ask people a certain set of questions and find out how they score on them, we could determine that this type of person is a furry. Well, that wouldn't be so bad, except that we're very dynamic. We change over time. The kind of person you were 5 years ago isn't the kind of person you are today, and it's not the same person you're going to be 5 years from now. So if we say a furry is a certain type of person, what we're saying is that, and given that we know that personality tends to be pretty consistent across age, we're saying that from the age of 2 or 3 years old, before people really know what a furry is or know much about anything, they're already a furry and just don't know it yet. So, and what's more is that we can have people who are furries but leave the fandom, as you'll find later on. We have a lot of people who leave the fandom at about the age of 30. And so the question is, if it's a certain type of person, how can you stop being it after a certain time? So these definitions don't really work for the purpose of cold, pragmatic research. So we at the International Anthropomorhpic Research Project endeavored to come up with our own definition, and it looks like this. Furries are people who call themselves furries. Now, at first glance, this isn't a particularly satisfying answer to the question of what a furry is. It seems kind of circular almost, or at very least it doesn't tell us anything about furries. So we'll try again and use this definition. Furries are people who self-identify with an interest in anthropomorphism. So in trying to define what a furry is, we're saying that they're people who identify with some interest, in this case an interest in anthropomorphism, the giving of human traits to animals or animal traits to humans. Zoomorphism. Now, this isn't a terrible definition. It's a little more satisfying than our previous one, but I want to show you that this is actually a pretty good definition, at least for the purpose of doing psychological research, especially social psychological research. And I want to compare it to another label, another identity that people typically apply to themselves, and that's political affiliation. So you can imagine, for example, that I walk up to you and say, hello, I'm Nuka, and I'm a Democrat, or I'm Nuka, I'm a Republican. Now, that's a useful label for me to use, because by telling you about my political orientation, you also know a few other pieces of information about me. You likely know a little bit about my morals and values. You know a little bit about the kinds of people I associate with. You may even know a little bit about some of my behavior. What political rallies I might attend or how I'm going to vote in the next election. So this is a useful piece of information, a useful label to apply to myself, because by telling you my political orientation, you know a whole bunch of other stuff about me. It's quite central to who I am as a person. Compare this to me saying, hello, I'm Nuka, and I'm a chocolate lover. Now, knowing that I'm a chocolate lover doesn't really tell you a lot else about me. You don't really know anything about my political orientation. You don't know about my most of my behavior. You don't know anything about the kinds of people I hang out with. My morals and my values are still quite mysterious to you. So this isn't a particularly useful label to apply because it doesn't tell anyone anything about me. This is why a label like a political label is an important one that people typically naturally use to define themselves versus something like chocolate lover, which isn't particularly useful. And we would argue that for furries, these are people for whom an interest in anthropomorphism is central to their identity, that by knowing that you're a furry, I know something about who you are, the kinds of people you hang out with, some of your morals and values. And that's what distinguishes a furry from someone who likes the occasional show that involves anthropomorphic characters. They may like these shows just like furries do, but there's something else. Furries define themselves by that liking, and it's very central to who they are and helps you understand a lot about them in the way that it doesn't define a non-furry. So it's a little complex, but that's the definition that we're working from. That's why the use of the label to apply to yourself is the most sort of central feature of this definition. Now, in talking about what furries are, it's also important to distinguish the furry fandom and members of it from related, overlapping identities as well. In this case, we're going to talk about two of them, the brony fandom and therians. Now, bronies, who are fans of the television show My Little Pony, are also a fandom like the furry fandom, and it overlaps quite a bit in the sense that these are people who tend to be fans of a show that feature walking, talking cartoon animals, in the same way that furries are fans of walking, talking animals. So at first glance, you may think that these are pretty much overlapping, identical groups. And in fact, there's some truth to this. We find that about 20 to 25% of furries also call themselves bronies. So there's definitely some overlap between these two categories. We don't have data on the flip side, how many bronies call themselves furries, but we do know, based on debates that you see online, that not all bronies consider themselves to be furries. In fact, there's kind of a debate right now with furries claiming, or many furries at least, claiming that bronies, like it or not, technically count as furries, and a lot of bronies who say that they're bronies, not furries, that they're two distinct sort of constructs. So we can see here why it's important to use clear definitions of what a furry is. Because if we kind of described furry by a certain behavior, if we said, oh, it's anyone who watches any show that has walking, talking animals, we might lump in a bunch of bronies who don't consider themselves to be furries and who might respond very differently to some of our items if asked. Now, when you ask furries how they feel about bronies, you get a very mixed response. So about 1/3 of furries are pretty positive towards bronies. They say, you know what, and many of these are bronies themselves, and they say, you know what, yeah, it's a fantastic addition to the furry fandom. They like anthropomorphic animals just like we do. The more the merrier. You find that about 25% of furries are really ambivalent on the issue, so they don't really have a strong opinion one way or another. They're perfectly happy to have bronies in the fandom, but they're not going to fight vehemently for them. It's kind of like a take it or leave it. We also find that about 40% of the furry fandom is vehemently opposed to bronies in the fandom. So they absolutely want nothing to do with bronies in the fandom, and if they had it their way, bronies wouldn't be part of the fandom altogether. Now, this is surprising when you look back and you realize that the interests of furries and bronies overlap so much. At the very beginning, we were saying that it seems like on paper, furries and bronies should essentially be the same thing. And yet you see here why it's so important to make a distinction. 40% of furries feel very strongly that bronies aren't a part of the fandom. And so it's important to be very clear what we mean by furries and what we mean by bronies. Now, when trying to understand why some furries dislike bronies in the fandom, we can sort of look at this attitude right here. Take a page out of Donald Trump's playbook and look at it as bronies are invading our fandom. This is the reason given by many furries for why they don't like bronies in the fandom. This idea that bronies come from outside the fandom and they somehow invade the fandom and bring with with them, memes and tropes and artwork and things that are sort of foreign or from the outside of the furry fandom. Now, I want to argue that this isn't actually supported by the data. The data suggests that, if anything, bronies in the furry fandom are furries who've been furries for quite some time, longer than non-bronies, in fact. And so bronies in the furry fandom aren't coming from outside the fandom typically. They're furries who've already been around for a while, who discover, in addition to other things, they also happen to like a cartoon that has walking, talking horses in it. We also find that furries who are bronies tend to have been furries at a younger age than non-brony furries are. So in other words, the bronies in the fandom tend to be coming from the fandom itself, not from invading masses of bronies. Now, to switch gears a little bit, we'll talk about therians, who are another group that oftentimes kind of gets lumped in with or mixed up with the definition of a furry. So furries, remember, are people who self-identify with an interest in anthropomorphic animals. Now, therians are different. Therians are people who actually self-identify as or with non-human animals. So nowhere in the definition of a furry does it say that a furry is a person who actually identifies with an animal. This is what a therian does, in fact. And we find that about 10 to 20%, depending on the sample, of furries actually consider themselves to be a therian. Now, to understand the difference between furries and therians, it's useful to look at a few illustrative questions. Now, we asked these questions to a group of just average Americans, to a group of furries, and to a group of therians who were also furries. So we asked them, first of all, if you were given the chance to flip a switch and just become non-human altogether, would you do it? What we found was that the non-furries, only about 10% of them said yes. A lot of people looked at it as kind of strange, and that's a weird question. Why would you ask that? About 39% of furries, they got it. They said, yeah, if I had a chance to, sure, I'd become a non-human animal if I could. But look at the therians. Almost 60% of them agreed with this statement, that if they could, they would give up being human and become entirely non-human. But it gets even more apparent that there's a difference between furries and therians on the next question. Do you feel less than 100% human? So right now, as you stand there, does something about you feel not entirely human? Now again, when you ask that question to just the average American, very few people agree with the sentiment. About 1 in 3 furries agrees with the sentiment and says, sure, I don't feel entirely human now that you mention it. But 86% of therians agree with this sentiment and say, yeah, I don't feel entirely human. This is a huge difference and represents why it's so important to us to be crystal clear in our working definition of whether we're talking about furries or therians, because this is one question where the difference really does matter. Now, when we talk about therians not feeling entirely human, it's important to note that this isn't necessarily delusion. This isn't a therian looking down and seeing paws instead of hands. This isn't a therian saying that if you were to give them a blood test or look at their genes, they know that they have human genes. Nevertheless, it's this feeling that they have the mindset, the mind or the spirit or the soul of a non-human being trapped in the physical body of a human. Moreover, people have asked us, well, is there some way to test whether this is just something therians say? So do therians really deep down feel human and they're just doing this to kind of get a rise out of people or assert their independence or their uniqueness? Well, we've actually kind of tested that already. So using a procedure that's kind of advanced for this particular talk, what we essentially do is look at the pattern of mistakes and reaction times that therians and furries have when they answer questions related to, they have to make snap decisions about whether or not a certain word counts as a human word, a non-human word, whether it pertains to themselves or not. What we find is that in therians, this doesn't just seem to be something that they say. When you actually look at the pattern of mistakes they make and the pattern of reaction times they show, the concept of self and animal is much more closely and inextricably linked in therians than it is in non-therians. So for therians, when you activate the concept of self, the concept of animal is also much more likely to be automatically activated. These two concepts are very, very tightly knit in therians in a way that it's not in furries. Other aspects of the phenomenology of being a Therian include the phenomenon of a phantom limb. So a phantom limb in psychology refers to having a physical sensation or an itch or a pain in a limb that's not there, whether it's because of an amputation or simply being born without that limb. People report having a sensation from a limb that isn't there sometimes. And many Therians report that this is the case, in particular with regard to a tail that isn't present. And what we find is that compared to furries, Therians are significantly more likely to have had this experience. Almost 85% of Therians say at one point or another they've sat down on what felt like a tail, or they felt pain or a sensation in the tail that wasn't there. And we find that about half of Therians find this to be a relatively disturbing experience to them. It's kind of jarring to have a sensation from a limb that isn't actually there. Now, people have asked us, when you're studying furries, when you're studying Therians, do you gain any understanding about how people in general work? In other words, why should the average person, why should a psychologist care if you've discovered something strange or quirky about furries or Therians? And this research right here is a perfect example of why we ought to care about the difference between furries and Therians and why these are differences that make a difference. So it's a well-known psychological finding that when you anthropomorphize something, you make people care about it more. So for example, researchers have long known that if you anthropomorphize the concept of Earth, talk about Mother Earth, or you put a face on a picture of the Earth and you put that on a recycling bin, people are much more likely to recycle because you've brought something non-human into the domain of human morality. So suddenly you respond to it the way you would respond morally to another human being. Now, in studying Therians, we've learned a thing or two about what happens when your concept of self is tied to the concept of non-animals. This involves the use of really complicated statistical models that, again, I'm not going to get into right now because it's far too advanced for this particular talk. But essentially, the gist of it is that to the extent that Therians self-dehumanize, that is, they tie their sense of self to animals rather than anthropomorphizing animals, they actually care more and act to help animals more. So there's greater concern for animal welfare. They're more willing to sign up for animal activism, male groups. So it suggests that the way their brain is working and tying the concept of self to animal together makes them care about animals in the same way that anthropomorphizing animals, giving animals human-looking faces or showing a chimpanzee with a very human-looking expression, makes other people care about animals more as well. And what's really cool is that we found this not just in Therians, but in college students as well. So the more college students and their sense of self respond on that cognitive task like a Therian does, the more they too show greater concern for animal welfare and a greater willingness to help out and play an active role in helping out animals. So the point of this whole introduction here is to argue that the definition that we use for furry matters. We're not just being pedantic or quibbling over philosophical distinctions here. These are differences that really do make a difference. Whether we're talking about a furry or a Therian or a brony really matters. And that's why we spend so much time making crystal clear that we're talking about, or what we mean when we're talking about furries in this particular context. So moving on from our definition of what a furry is, let's talk about something that most furries do, and that's create a persona. So even though we said earlier that there's no one behavior that all furries engage in, persona creation is probably the most universal behavior in the furry fandom. We find that at least 95% of furries say that they currently, or at least in the past, have had one or more personas. Most of the time we find that furries only have one persona at a time, although that said, there are a number of furries who do simultaneously hold multiple personas, which can be depending on your mood that day, or depending on what mindset you're in, it may switch. But you find very few furries who jump between 5 or 6 or 10 different personas in rapid succession. In fact, when you talk to furries, a lot of them say that they created one persona, it lasted them for quite some time, and it's only after years of change or some really, really jarring real-world sort of incident that they come to change their persona. So there's not a lot of furries changing their personas like they change their underwear. Now, when you ask, or when the average sort of person who doesn't know anything about furries or the media ask about furries, this is typically one misconception they have. There's this idea that furries wake up in the morning and decide, oh, I'm going to be a dog today and a cat tomorrow and a lion next week, and that's not really the case. For furries, it seems that their personas are deep and personal, and it's something that they carry around with them for quite some time, and very few of them, it would seem, less than half, seem to change them with any kind of frequency. And we see this reflected in other data as well. So when we ask furries, hey, where did your persona come from? Was it something you just sort of watched on TV and decided to kind of, oh, I like lions, so I'll take that as part of my persona? Or was it something sort of from inside you? And we find that most furries agree, on the left side of the figure here, that my persona came almost entirely from within me. So it's some deeply held feeling or belief or idea that they had that contributed to their persona species. And if you talk to furries about the reasons they chose the species they did, most of the time it has some deeply meaningful or significant story associated with it. Maybe they grew up with a beloved pet that they just felt like they understood. Maybe it was a trip to the zoo when they were really young that had a very powerful impact on them. We also find that when furries create personas, they tend to be deeply reflective of who they are. So we ask furries, hey, is your persona exactly like you, or is it totally different from you? Most furries agree, the vast majority of furries agree, that their persona represents something deep and meaningful about them and is virtually identical to who they are. If not completely identical, it's very, very close to who they are. So very few furries create personas that are completely different from who they are. Again, reinforcing this idea that furries create personas sort of from within them. Now, we asked 5 years ago a huge sample of nearly 5,000 furries what their persona was in order to gauge what the most popular species was. This was a question that came up quite frequently, again, from the media and from furries themselves who just wanted to know what are the most popular species. And we found 5 years ago that the most popular species was a wolf. We asked again 5 years later, so at Anthropomorhpic last year, what the most popular species were, or asked people rather to identify their persona to see what the most popular species was. And sure enough, we found that wolves still have it. So pretty consistently, at least across the past 5 years, wolves seem to be the most prevalent persona species. And you can see here in this figure that wolves tend to dominate quite a bit. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of all furries identify in whole or in part with a wolf. But we also see other quite popular species as well, include foxes, dragons, cats, dogs, tigers, and various mythological creatures. Now, one question we're often asked by the media is whether or not it matters whether a furry chooses a cat or a dog or a bear or a rabbit as their persona species. Are these differences that matter? Now, when we ask furries, does your persona species matter? Does it tell people about you? Furries do believe that it does. Furries genuinely are of the opinion that if I know that you're a cat or I know that your persona is a dog, I know a little bit more about the kind of person you are. That said, however, most furries agree that they wouldn't judge other furries on the basis of their persona species. So when media people ask us about a furry convention that they've never been to before, there's this misconception that all the cats go into one room and all the dogs go into one room and all the bears go into one room. And that's really not how the furry fandom interacts. Furries agree that a persona tells you something about who you are, but very few say that they would judge a person or choose not to interact with a person solely on the basis of what their persona species is. That said, we did some research recently on the subject of stereotypes and how stereotypes pertain to particular species. So we asked furries to state their persona species, so what is your species, and then tell us 3 stereotypes that exist about your species. What we found was that certain traits kept coming up as being the most popular traits among persona species. So loyalty, sly, strong, fun, shy, adorable, intelligent. These are the kinds of traits that kept coming up over and over again, seemingly across different personas. We decided to break it down by species to see whether or not certain species were more frequently associated with particular stereotypes. And for those who think that sex is deeply associated with the fandom, we found that the trait sexiness, or anything to do with sex for that matter, was way down in 33rd place in terms of how frequently it came up as a stereotype. So a lot of factors sort of weigh into this stereotype of a particular species. Sex isn't usually one of them. So we asked people about wolves. We found that loyalty was the defining trait or the most prevalent stereotype that existed about wolves. Among foxes, it was being sly. Among dragons, it was being strong. Among cats, it was kind of a mixed bag, and I'm ashamed as a cat persona myself that laziness was the defining trait of cats. Dogs were pretty unilaterally defined by loyalty, almost more so than wolves. And with rabbits, we found that it tended to be defined by shyness more than anything else. And otters, of course, very few people will be surprised to find that otters were defined almost exclusively by enjoyment of fun. Now, what's interesting is that there is a stereotype, a prevalent stereotype, or at least a belief that a particular stereotype exists about foxes, and that is namely the association of foxes with perversion or with sex. And we found some evidence that that was true, but there was in fact one species even more frequently associated with sex, and that was rabbits. And it's not entirely surprising, given that our society is one that often associates rabbits with virility or fertility. We talk about the Playboy bunnies, for example. So this isn't necessarily shocking. Now, one other thing that's worth noticing if you look back at this table full of stereotypes is that most of these traits tend to be remarkably positive traits. In fact, you find that I think of the top 10, 9 out of 10 of these traits are resoundingly positive traits. Now, this finding tends to overlap quite a bit with another finding we found that suggests that personas are idealized versions of ourselves, that when furries create personas, they're similar to who you are, but slightly better version of who you are. Now, this figure here sort of asks people to indicate to what extent is your persona more of this than you or less of this than you. So for each trait, a lower bar means that you are more like this than your persona, and a higher bar means your persona is more of this than you are. So what we find is that furries say that they are more shy and introverted and unstable and intolerant and cold-hearted than their persona is. But their personas are more playful and energetic and confident and attractive and likable, better versions of who they are. So personas like you, but a slightly better you. And we see this perhaps most vividly demonstrated in research on furries who have physical or psychological disabilities. So when we asked these furries about their personas, many of them suggested that despite having a physical disability themselves, they created personas that did not have the same disabilities. And part of the reason for this was because the persona allowed furries to interact with other people without their disability being the center of attention, being the most salient feature in that interaction. So when interacting with other furries online, people would notice, first of all, the species they picked or their appearance, this appearance that lacked the disability, rather than looking and interacting with the person solely on the basis of a particular disability. So this again suggests that many furries create personas that are idealized or slightly better versions of who they are in person. Now again, to go back to the real-world implications, why should psychologists or other scientists care that furries create these personas? Well, with technology becoming more and more widespread, people have the opportunity to create idealized versions of themselves in sort of the digital realm. So your Facebook profile is a perfect example of people tailoring a virtual self that's like them but slightly better. Typically, you only put the better parts of yourself on Facebook for display to the public. Dating profiles are the same thing. You tend to put your best foot forward, which is in part what a lot of furries are doing with their personas. So by understanding if this is good for furries, we can also understand whether this is good for World of Warcraft players, Second Life players, anyone who uses Facebook. We can better understand what are the implications of having these fantasy or virtual or not you versions of you that are slightly better than you for your well-being. Moving on from personas, we'll talk a little bit about other things that furries tend to do. Now, there's a misconception about what furries do that you often see in the media. And that's typically that furries are people who wear fursuits. Fursuits are the most visible aspect of the fandom and often the most laughed at parts of the fandom. So it's worth starting here and seeing whether there's some truth to the idea that furries are people who wear fursuits. And in fact, the data suggests that that's not the case. Despite the fact that most people think of fursuits when thinking about furries, only about 13% of furries actually owns a full fursuit. And in fact, we find that when you broaden the definition to include a partial fursuit, the number is still less than 20% of furries. So most furries, in fact, do not own fursuits, despite the fact that furries are oftentimes defined by fursuits. And even if you broaden the category even more and don't talk about fursuits, but say, well, maybe furries are people who own furry stuff and they wear furry stuff like tails or ears, even then we find that the most popular item, tails, is still owned by less than half of furries. So it's inaccurate to describe or define furries as people who dress up, because that's something that some furries choose to do as a way of manifesting their interests, but it's certainly not universal among furries, or even the most popular way of manifesting this particular interest. Despite that, however, we see plenty of news outlets who are happy to report that furries are people who wear suits, who have sex in suits, who congregate and wear these silly mascot suits. It almost seems like the media is more obsessed with fursuits than furries are. So in trying to understand what furries do, it's important to get fursuits out of your mind, because there's plenty of other things that furries do when interacting with other furries or going online outside of the fursuits. As you can see on the screen here, these are just some examples among a myriad, hundreds, thousands of examples of things that furries do, besides just putting on suits and hanging out with one another. We find, for example, that most furries interact with other furries. This is something that furries like to do. And many of them do so in person. We find that about half of furries try to make it out to at least one convention a year. And that con may vary depending on geographic location. But regardless, we find that about half the fandom is defined by, at least in part, by interacting with other furries at conventions or at local fur meets, whether it's going out to a restaurant or attending a furry-themed party or going out to a park and hanging out with other furries. This is one thing that furries do. This is compounded, this is even bigger online. We find that furries love to hang out with other furries online, whether it's in furry-themed forums, talking to other furries in instant messaging programs. In both these instances, about 80% of furries do this on a daily or weekly basis. We also find that 15 to 20% of furries say they use IMVU or Second Life or some other place, virtual world, where they can interact with other furries on a daily or weekly basis. So it seems that furries really do like to hang out with other furries, and that's something that's commonly left out in the media narrative, where people may get this idea that furries are people who sit around the house wearing a fuzzy costume sort of by themselves, and that's not surprising then, if that's the idea they have, that furries may have some kind of maladjustment or be just a little weird. Furries are also a remarkably creative and productive culture. So it's what we call a participatory culture, where you don't just sit back and passively consume, but many furries themselves create. A fact illustrated by the fact that one of the first things many furries do when joining the fandom is create a persona themselves. And content creation isn't just unique to the creation of a persona. We find that about 60% of furries produce some form of visual art. Now, while not every furry is a Dark Natasha or very famous, well-known artist, a lot of furries seem to at least dabble in the visual arts, and the same thing is true when it comes to the written arts. We find that about 50% of furries tend to do some creative writing in their spare time. Again, not every furry is a Kyle Gold, but we find that many furries love to self-express this interest in anthropomorphism through the creation of writing. As sort of a tangent, we recently did some research looking at artists in the furry fandom, so looking specifically at those people who create content, and this research in particular was focused on artists who were better known, artists who were at a convention selling their material, either taking commissions or selling prints, but they were artists who were making at least a little bit of money by selling their products to the fandom. Now, among this group, we found that they were much more likely to be women than men. As we'll see in a few slides here, this is sort of the reverse of what we find in the general furry population, which tends to be dominated by men. We also find that among artists in the fandom, especially artists who are selling content to the fandom, about 2/3 of them self-identify themselves as furries. What we find are many artists were artists first. They were artists in other domains, they made other content, and only later on did they stumble upon the furry fandom or furry artwork as an outlet with a particularly eager audience. Even among furry artists who sell their content at conventions, very few of these artists said that they actually made their sole income through the artwork that they sold to the fandom. So many of the artists that you commission work part or full-time jobs out in the real world. We also find that furry artists like to hang out with other furry artists as well. So about 50% of the friends in the fandom that furry artists have are themselves also furry artists. And despite the belief that the furry fandom is inundated with pornography, we find that only about 17% of artists in the fandom say that the work they produce is mostly erotic. So most furry artists say that some or all of their artwork is actually quite clean in nature. Now, this table here looks a little intimidating, but it's well worth the price of admission, so stick with me here. What we did was we asked furries and we asked furry artists a series of questions that have to do with fan entitlement. So fan entitlement in this case is this belief that you as a fan deserve certain treatments from the content creators. So if you look at some of the items here on the left, these are things like I expect an artist to meet me in person if I'm a really big fan, perhaps at a convention or if we live nearby. I expect artists to go above and beyond my expectations and constantly wow me. If I email the artist, I expect to get an email back. I should get special treatment for being devoted. Artists are required to listen to their fans and their suggestions. Fans are obligated to let artists know that their work is subpar and artists should be listening to it. And fans in general should get special treatment. Now, in the first column, the artists believe, we asked artists themselves how much they personally endorse each of these items. So how entitled are they whenever they themselves are commissioning artwork from other artists? You see the values there. Next, in the next column to the right, we asked artists in the fandom how much they think the average furry endorses these items. So higher numbers mean more entitled. And we found that across each of the items, artists believed that the average furry was more entitled than they were. Now the third column is the responses that about 1,000 non-artist furries gave to each of these questions. And what you find is that in the second column, artists expected that the average furry would score pretty high on this scale, but in the third column, we saw that the average was much lower for the average furry. And in fact, in the last column, this is what percentage of furries were as bad as artists expected. We see that number for most of the item tends to hover between 5 and 15%. So very few furries, it would seem, are as bad as artists anticipate when it comes to entitlement. Now, there's a few possible ways that one can interpret this data, and it's important to note that these data tell a story, and it's not necessarily clear. One possibility is that the artists are completely wrong. So artists have this belief that fans are particularly entitled, and in actuality, fans aren't nearly as entitled as artists think. Now, this idea that it's a few bad apples that are spoiling the bunch has some basis in the psychological literature. So there's work on something called the availability heuristic, which suggests that one particularly vivid example can taint your perception of a group. It's the reason why so many people are afraid to fly in planes and are afraid of plane crashes, despite the fact that statistically a person is safer in a plane than in a car. It's because plane crashes are much more vivid. So for artists, it may be the case that a handful of really bad commissioners, the commissioners from hell, are the ones that are tainting their perception of just how bad commissioners are. Because when you ask artists how bad are commissioners, the ones that come to mind most readily are the really bad commissioners. So this kind of makes sense that artists, maybe they're completely overestimating how bad the average fan is. On the other hand, there's also psychological research showing that people are biased to see themselves in a positive manner. We have biases and cognitive tricks that we use to think about ourselves in a positive way. No one likes to think that they're the commissioner from hell. We like to believe that we are all pretty good, decent people, and as such, when asked, many of us tend to respond in desirable ways on surveys such as these. Chances are what's happening here is a little bit of both. It's probably the case that artists' estimation of how bad the average furry is tainted a little bit by particularly bad examples, by particularly bad commissioners. That said, the average furry and their estimation of how good a commissioner they are is probably at least somewhat colored by their desire to see themselves in a favorable way. Now, again, tying this back to why the average psychologist should care about fan-creator relationships in the furry fandom, this can actually be quite informative when it comes to other fandoms, other domains. So, for example, trying to understand why fans of Star Wars felt entitled to tell George Lucas what the prequel movies should have been and should have contained, despite the fact that the films themselves were his creation. This was his story, but fans felt entitled to tell him what they should have been. So by understanding the relationship between content creators and fans in the furry fandom, we might be able to look to other fandoms as well and better understand relationships within those fandoms. Now, jumping back to the topic of what furries do, we've done a few studies and found that there are a number of things that are pretty universally liked by furries. We find, for example, that furries really like science fiction stories. They like video games, cartoons, webcomics, artwork. Most of you listening to this probably like some or most of these things. We also find that there are some things that are not universally liked, but pretty frequently liked among furries. So things like anime, tabletop gaming, role-playing, mucks. These are things that a lot of furries enjoy, even if it's not quite as unanimous as some of the things in the first category. And in looking at these categories, we really only found one activity that furries pretty unanimously disliked. And that was sports. We're not entirely sure why, but for whatever reason, furries aren't really a fan of sports. Maybe this has something to do with furries being bullied in high school, and if furries comprise a sort of a geek culture, then the sort of antithesis to the geek is the jock, and maybe furries were beaten up by those who liked sports. Maybe it's the case that furries as a fandom are particularly stigmatized, whereas the sports fandoms, the NFL, the NBA, tend to be pretty widely accepted and endorsed by the general population. So maybe there's some frustration there. Either way, the research suggests that furries don't seem to be very fond of sports. We've looked at other things that furries do on this figure here, with higher bars indicating that furries really support this as being a central part of the furry fandom. So you see that art and a sense of community, conventions, local meetups, and acceptance are all pretty defining central features of what the furry fandom entails. You'll notice that drama is particularly low on this. So despite this idea that drama is prevalent in the fandom, that drama is a defining feature of the furry fandom, the data don't seem to suggest that that's the case. Finally, though, I want to talk about this last bar here, sex in the fandom. Because the issue of furries, sex, and pornography is a particularly charged one in the fandom, and it's one that many furries find to be quite a divisive issue. It's one of the ones that's really hard for furries to talk about, in part because there's so much risk that you're going to offend or upset other people. So we're going to delve into it today and talk a little bit about what the research suggests about the issue of sex and pornography in the furry fandom. What's the truth? First off, I want to start off by looking at sexual orientation in the furry fandom. Now what you see on the screen here is a representation of a typical Kinsey scale. So it's a 0 to 6 scale. On the left side, it's exclusive heterosexuality, and on the right side of the scale, it's exclusive homosexuality. And what you see here is that in the sample of the general American population, the vast majority of people more than 90% consider themselves to be either exclusively heterosexual or predominantly heterosexual. So we're talking about heterosexual except for that one time in college. So the vast majority of Americans consider themselves to be heterosexual. Now, when you include the data on furries, you see a very different picture. Not nearly as many furries consider themselves to be exclusively or predominantly heterosexual. In fact, only about 35% of furries fall into this category compared to almost 90% of the average American. On the flip side of the scale, looking to the very right end, we see that furries are about 6 to 7 times more likely than the general population to consider themselves to be exclusively or predominantly homosexual. We also have some data on asexuality, finding that between 3 and 4% of the fandom consider themselves to be asexual, and another 15% of the fandom say they don't fall anywhere on this dichotomy of heterosexual to homosexual. So shifting gears a bit, we move from sexual orientation to relationships, looking at whether or not there's some truth to this idea, this stereotype, that furries are predominantly single males living in their parents' basements. And the data suggests that at least among males in the fandom, they are predominantly single. So we find that almost 60% of furry males call themselves single or not currently in a relationship. On the flip side, women are far more likely to be in a relationship in the furry fandom. This is either dating or engaged or currently married. The issue of pornography in the fandom is a very divisive one, so we're going to tread carefully into the data here. But what we show, perhaps unsurprisingly to anyone listening to this, is that pornography exists in the furry fandom. This is perhaps one of the few statements that's going to be contentious. We also find that most male furries view pornography. In fact, 96% of males in the fandom do say that they look at pornography, and about 17% of them say that the only pornography they look at is furry-themed. We also find that most females in the fandom also look at pornography, although far fewer of them, only 2.2%, say that they only look at exclusively furry-themed pornography. So both men and women in the fandom do seem to look at pornography in general. But what's interesting is that men in the fandom seem to be far more positive about it than women. So when asked how comfortable they felt about pornography in the fandom, most males felt pretty comfortable, if not very comfortable, and very positively towards the issue of sex and porn in the fandom. In contrast, we found that among women in the fandom, it was much more contentious an issue. Women were far less likely to say that they felt positively about porn in the fandom, and the most popular answer was to feel very ambivalent, feeling neither very positive nor very negative about it, somewhere in the middle. Now, this isn't surprising when you consider that the fandom is a predominantly male space. Much of the artwork in the furry fandom, especially the pornography, is geared towards the male gaze. It's geared towards a male audience. And so you have artwork that's intended to show off the features or the kinds of themes that are very popular to men and are and less so to sort of emphasize the themes that are popular to women. If you're an artist in the fandom and you're trying to get a fan base, you're going to cater your work towards the largest number of people. So this is one possible explanation for why men in the fandom may feel so much more positively about the content of pornography than women do. That said, so despite the fact that we find that most furries look at porn and that a lot of furries feel quite positively about porn, especially the male furries, we find that there isn't a super strong preference for pornographic themes artwork. So when we ask furries about the furry art that they do look at, we see that there's some preference. Looking at the bars, they kind of skew towards the right, but the most popular answer is to say, well, there's no real strong preference. In general, furries just like furry-themed art. They also like furry-themed art that's pornographic because many furries like sex. But it isn't the case that furries are madly and overwhelmingly picking just the pornographic art. So furries just like furry art. And in fact, when we go one step further and ask furries to what extent is pornography, furry porn, the biggest driver of your getting in and staying into the fandom, we find that very few people say that this is the case. So on the right here, we have people who say, that I'm only here for furry porn. We find that very, very few people actually endorse this item. Almost exclusively men do. On the left side of the figure, we find that far more people, especially women in the fandom, say that no, porn isn't at all the reason why I'm here. There are other reasons, bigger reasons, driving my involvement in the furry fandom. So this is one of the arguments put forth to counter the claim that the furry fandom is a fetish. For people who say that furry is first and foremost a fetish, if that were the case, you wouldn't see this pattern of results. If furry were really a fetish, you would see most people saying that they're here first and foremost, or at least predominantly, for the porn, for the sexual content. And that's not really the case here. Now, we did a study quite recently in the last year looking at pornography, which actually involved having furries at a convention look at varying degrees of explicit furry artwork, ranging from clothed, completely clean furry artwork you could show your grandmother to very, very explicit artwork. And we had them look at both furry and non-furry pornography. It was counterbalanced to ensure that there was an equal amount of straight, lesbian, and gay artwork in the mix. And then we extended this study by having a comparison group. We actually did the exact same study in a sample of college students who looked at both non-furry and furry-themed pornography for science, these brave souls. And what we found, pretty interestingly, was that there's an expectation among furries that non-furries will burst into flame and be absolutely aghast when they see furry pornography. But the data didn't seem to bear that out. When it came to the furry artwork, the explicit furry artwork, and just the erotic furry artwork, when asked how explicit this was, how graphic and extreme and explicit this content was, furries actually rated it more hardcore and more extreme than non-furries did. So non-furries didn't seem to be as bothered by the content. It didn't seem to react so viscerally to it in the same way that furries did. And we think in part this has to do with furries having sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the topic of porn. This anticipation of disapproval may cause furries to sort of defensively treat even relatively innocuous work as being quite pornographic, if only to make sure that it doesn't fall into non-furry hands and lead to judgment. So I want to summarize this section on pornography and sex by saying that sex in the furry fandom is remarkably complex, just like sex in general for humans is remarkably complex. It's one of the most contentious and divisive issues in the fandom, and it's probably the case that anytime someone makes a blanket statement about what all furries think about sex, or what all furries think about porn, what all furries do, it's probably wrong. Given how much variation there is, given how much variety there is in human sexuality in general, it's not surprising to find that few furries agree when it comes to the topic of sex and pornography in the fandom. Perhaps one of the things that the data do suggest, however, is that despite the fears that many furries have about how non-furries will respond if they ever saw furry pornography, the data seem to suggest that it may be a little bit overblown. It may not be as bad as furries expect. Moving on, we'll next talk about demographics and the composition of the furry fandom. So we find that the furry fandom is a predominantly young fandom. Now, keep in mind when looking at this data that our research team is not allowed, for ethical reasons, to look at minors. So our data starts by collecting people at the age of 18, but you can imagine that this curve includes a second half that includes a number of teenagers, older and younger teenagers as well. What we find is that the fandom is a predominantly young fandom. Even without including these younger people, we still find that the vast majority of the furry fandom is under the age of 30. More than 80% of furries are under the age of 30. So we see this huge fall off after that point. We also see that there's a group of furries who call themselves gray muzzles. And there's no sort of official cutoff for where this point is, but we found that among furries who call themselves gray muzzles, the average age tends to be about 42, 43 years old, although we have found furries as young as 18 or 19 years old calling themselves gray muzzles. The gist of this is to suggest that if a furry is into their 30s or 40s, they're getting up there in terms of being one of the older members of the fandom. Now that said, we've also asked furries, in addition to how old they are, how old they feel. And what we find is that the older you get in the furry fandom, subjectively, the younger you feel as a percentage of your current age. So the way I kind of jokingly put this is to say that furries tend to be about 25, at least mentally. They all kind of feel 25 years old. So furries who are about the age of 25, say that that's about how they feel. But the older you get, the farther you get from 25, the younger you feel as a percentage of your age. So it seems like most people, even older furries, tend to feel relatively young, and it may be the case that the fandom allows them to maintain this sort of younger felt subjective age. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about sex and gender in the furry fandom. Now, we've assessed these separately, recognizing that there's a difference between the biological body that a person is born in and the social construct of gender. So we asked these separately, and what we found is that the furry fandom, in general, is a predominantly male-driven fandom. Whether you're looking at sort of biological differences or gender identity, we find the fandom is predominantly male. This is sort of the reverse of what we found in artists, which were far more likely to be female. Even more interestingly, we found that the furry fandom, about 10% of furries say that they don't feel like they fit onto, they're gender non-binary or gender queer. So they don't fall onto the traditional male-female dichotomy. Even more, we find that this is almost twice as likely in furry artists as it is in the general furry population. We also find that about 2.1% of furries identify themselves as trans, which is about 7 times more prevalent than that's prevalent in the general American population, suggesting that the furry fandom may be a place for people who are transgender to express themselves in a way that they feel safe, or in a place where they'll be accepted for who they are. In terms of the ethnic composition of the fandom, we find that the fandom is a predominantly white space, in the sense that about 80% of furries identify as white. In terms of some of the socioeconomic variables pertaining to the furry fandom, we find that about 70% of furries are either currently enrolled in some kind of post-secondary education or have already completed some kind of post-secondary education. We also find that among the careers that furries tend to go into, we find that there are a lot of the same careers you would find in very tech-savvy, geek sort of samples, geek or nerd samples. So we find that furries oftentimes wind up in the hard sciences, doing jobs that have to do with computers or IT, or with graphic or visual design. It was once asked whether furries were defined in parts by having broken families or coming from families of divorce. We find that about 1/3 of furries say that they had parents who had divorced, a number which does not differ significantly from that of the general population. What did differ, interestingly, was the number of furries who said they were the oldest child. So among furries who were in families with multiple children, we found that furries were far more likely to be the older child than they were to be the younger child, a phenomenon that we're still to this day unable to fully account for or explain. God help us, we also find that furries are reproducing, and about 4% of furries say they currently have children. So the stereotype of furries is that they are single white males living in their parents' basement, and at first blush, this seems to suggest that this data here seems to suggest that many furries live with their parents. It's worth noting, however, that the furry fandom is a predominantly young fandom as well. When you separate the data to account for age, we find that the vast majority of furries who are under the age of 24 make up the furries who are living with their parents. And this isn't surprising. This is actually what you find in the general population as well. With the bad economy and sort of with growing trends of staying in school for longer, we find that people are living with their parents at older and older ages, and the furry fandom is just reflecting what's sort of a general trend in the population. And by the time furries hit 24 or 25 years old, many of them have moved out to either live with roommates or live by themselves or to live with relationship partners. In terms of the religious composition of the furry fandom, we've asked this question in several samples, and we find pretty consistent results. About 25% of the fandom identifies as Christian. About between 1/3 and 1/2 of the fandom consider themselves to be atheist and or agnostic. And the rest of furries tend to fall somewhere into an other category that includes pagan or Wiccan beliefs, Jewish beliefs, Buddhism, other deist beliefs, etc., etc. It's also worth comparing furries to other fandoms, which is what we're going to do in this section here, looking at how furries stack up against other fan groups, but also looking at what the effects are of spending time in the furry fandom and how it may change furries over time. So to compare furries, we wanted to look at how furries stack up against a group that was very similar to furries, anime fans, but also a group that was very distinctly different in terms of content from furries, in this case fantasy sport fans. And what we found, so different colored bars on these figures mean statistically significant differences. What we found is that there's actually a scale called the social awkwardness scale, and furries didn't differ significantly from convention-going anime fans, that's the A sample there, and fantasy sport fans, although it was the case that online anime fans were more socially awkward, at least as measured by the scale, than furries were. We also found that in terms of the content of these fandoms, the furry fandom was far less violent than either the sport fandoms or the different anime fans. We found, however, that in terms of pornography, there was much more pornographic content in the furry fandom than in these other fandoms as well. And we found that furries were much more motivated by sex to participate in the fandom than were anime fans or fantasy sport fans. Now, before you believe that furry fans are exclusively motivated by sex, you should see that there are other motivations here, namely entertainment, where furries are scoring much, much higher. So you saw the mean was less than 4 for the sex motivation, but for the entertainment motivation, furries scored much, much higher on this, suggesting that while sex was one of the motivators for furry to participate in the furry fandom, it wasn't the defining motivator. And in fact, we see this as well when it comes to identifying with the fan community. Many furries say that the fandom provides them with a sense of belongingness, a sense of community that's really motivating their staying around in the fandom. And we see that borne out in this data, where furries are much more feel a sense of belongingness to the community than you see in other fandoms. And in fact, further illustrating this, we find that 30% of straight furries and almost 80% of gay furries say that they found their current relationship partner in the fandom. So this isn't a matter of, this is the group that I hang out with once a week to read comic books with or hang out with. But for many furries, the connections they make in the furry fandom tend to be very deep, important, very meaningful ones. So it's worth asking at this point, what are the effects of the furry fandom on furries themselves? Does spending time in the furry fandom change the kind of person you are? Humorously illustrated in this particular comic. Well, we found a few things that suggest that the furry fandom may change the way furries think. So for example, in this particular study, we had furries and non-furry college students look at faces. Furry faces, non-furry faces, and fursuit faces. So by furry faces, we mean artwork featuring anthropomorphic characters. And what we found was that furries didn't differ from the non-furry college students when it came to recognizing human faces. They did about as well. However, when it came to recognizing furry faces and fursuit faces, furries were much better at recognizing these faces. So when we say recognition, what we mean is that we would show more than 100 pictures to furries of just, various people and fursuits and artwork, and then we would ask them later on, we'd show them a series of 100 pictures, 50 of which they had seen before and 50 of which were brand new, and we would ask our participants, did you see this face earlier in the study? Furries were very, very good, even better than they were at recognizing human faces, at recognizing anthropomorphic animal characters and fursuit faces. We suspect that part of this reason is due to the fact that that furry faces provide furries with additional cues that may not be present in human faces. Cues like color, cues like species, cues like the artist or the fursuit maker, which may allow them to better recognize these faces than college students would. Moreover, given that so much of furries' identity is put into personas, furries may develop a particularly good or particularly keen sense of recognition, being able to tell your best friend's wolf persona from some other wolf persona. One other effect the furry fandom may have on furries is to increase what's called global citizenship. Global citizenship is this psychological construct that suggests that you care about the world outside of you. You care about other people, you care about helping other people, you care about the input that other people provide for you, you care about the environment, and you feel a sense of responsibility to help those around you, even if they may not be in your particular group. And we find in a study that was actually published in a psychological journal that furries are particularly good. The more furry you were, the more you cared about global citizenship and actually personally identified as a global citizen yourself. And I think there's a few reasons for this. One reason is that the furry fandom is a geographically diverse fandom, meaning that if you're a furry, some of your friends may live across the country, some of them may live in other countries altogether, but you interact with them with some frequency, especially online. And because of that, when furries think of members of their in-group, people that matter to them, they're thinking across state or national boundaries. And so they pretty regularly think about entire countries or the entire planet as part of a community that matters to them. What's more is the furry fandom publicly adopts many of these very liberal, very progressive norms. So furries make no secret about being very progressive when it comes to issues like gay marriage, being very progressive when it comes to issues like inclusion of members of other ethnic groups. And so because of that, many furries internalize those norms and themselves start to care about it. When you see other people who are important to you caring about these sorts of issues, you yourself begin to take them on as well. We've asked furries to sort of plot their trajectory in the fandom. So we asked furries 10 years ago, how furry were you? And 5 years ago, how furry were you? And how furry are you today? And 10 years from now, how furry will you be? And one thing that doesn't seem to matter too much is how long you've actually been in the fandom. So whether you've been a furry for 6 months or for 6 years, we tend to find the same pattern of results. 10 years ago, you weren't as furry as you are now, but 10 years from now, you're still going to be quite furry. Now, this is quite interesting because it seems to contradict what the age data suggests. The age data suggests that there's quite a big fallout of furries by the time you get to the age of about 30. About the age of 30, many furries have already left the fandom. So it seems that furries may kind of get blindsided by leaving the fandom. Although we're not entirely sure what causes furries to leave the fandom, it seems to be that most furries don't expect to leave the fandom, despite the fact that the data suggests that a lot of them eventually do. One of the ways we're trying to catch furries leaving the fandom is by asking this question right here. A year from now, how furry do you expect to be compared to how furry you are now? And you can see the vast majority of furries say that they're going to be as furry, if not more furry, than they are now. But a small handful of furries seem to suggest this very negative trajectory that in a year from now, they're going to be pretty much out of the fandom. We think these are furries who are kind of on their way out now. And what we'd like to do in future studies is catch these people before they leave and figure out what's causing them to leave to help better understand why so many furries seem to leave the fandom by the time they hit the age of 30. Now, another thing we've looked at is how much furries self-disclose over time and whether or not that changes. So by self-disclose, we mean, do furries tell other people around them that they're furries? And what we find is that spending more time in the fandom makes furries more openly furry. So on a 1 to 5 scale here, we found an increase of almost half a point just based on spending 1 more year in the fandom. So in this case, we're talking about a longitudinal study where we measure the same furries again and again and again over a few years to see how their responses change. And it seems to suggest that the more time you spend in the fandom, the more open you become about being furry, telling your friends, your family, your coworkers that you are in fact a furry. Now, this raises an important question. Why wasn't every furry perfectly open about being a furry? Why did we find variance in that data? And for anyone who spent time on the internet, this may not be a particularly surprising finding that not all furries wish to discuss being furry with other people. It's illustrated quite nicely in this particular figure here, which ranks the different fandoms in terms of which groups are sort of more geeky, which groups are on top, and which ones are less respected. If you're looking for furries, furries are way down here at the bottom of the hierarchy, one step above erotic furries, and a step above people who write erotic versions of Star Trek where all the characters are furries, like Kirk is an ocelot or something. So it kind of comically hinted this idea that a lot of furries have experienced, that furries seem to be kind of at the bottom of the geek hierarchy. They're kind of the internet's punching bag. And we see this reflected in other data as well. So when we asked members of these different fandoms, hey, if other people knew about your fan identity, do you think that they would disapprove? And we found that furries experience this significantly more than anime fans or fantasy sport fans. We also found that furries were less likely to say that they self-disclose their fan identity to other people. So compared to anime fans and fantasy sport fans, furries were far less likely to say they actually told other people in their lives that they were, in fact, a member of this group. Which brings us to our last section, which has to do with the question, are furries crazy? If people are looking down at furries and sort of stigmatizing them, is there some reason, some explanation for why they're doing it? So before asking whether or not furries are crazy, it's worth asking what do we mean by crazy? Because it can certainly be argued that furries have an uncommon interest. Very few people would say that they have an interest in walking, talking animals. So maybe this is a good criterion to use for defining craziness. But it's also worth noting that many people have really uncommon interests. For example, model train enthusiasts. These are people who have an interest that's shared by very few people, and yet we don't seem to think of them as crazy or stigmatize them or make them feel bad for their interest in the same way that society seems to do for furries. Also recall that there's no one behavior that's distinctly furry. We can't say that behaving this way makes you crazy, because for any behavior within the furry fandom, there's examples of non-furries doing it and not taking flack for it. So for example, wearing fuzzy suits. Maybe this is crazy, but when it comes to mascots at sporting games, very few people would say that that person is crazy, the same way they would say that about a furry. What about looking at webcomics or watching cartoons? Well, a lot of other fandoms do that as well. Members of the anime fandom, for example, read manga quite frequently and don't take the kind of flack for it that furries do for enjoying furry-themed webcomics, for example. And what about this idea of having a fantasy identity? So we find that furries have these personas that aren't real, and maybe that makes them crazy. And yet we don't have the same stigma directed towards members of, say, World of Warcraft guilds, who maybe they're a little nerdy or considered nerdy by society, but don't take the kind of flack or these assumptions of being crazy the same way that furries do. So maybe it's worth asking, are furries less functional? If you want to know if they're crazy, maybe they're dysfunctional and don't function well in society. Maybe that's what makes them crazy, and maybe that's what leads to this kind of stigma. Well, there is evidence suggesting that furries have particularly vivid fantasy lives. So for example, compared to non-furries, furries are much more likely to have supernatural or magical beliefs. They, for recreational purposes, entertain the idea of walking, talking animals and spirituality and souls and magical thinking. They're much more likely to entertain these notions. They're also much more likely to have vivid mental imagery. So when you ask a furry and a non-furry to picture something in their minds, the research seems to suggest that furries have much more vivid mental experiences than non-furries do. They also have much more hypersensitive senses, and they tend to visually hallucinate more frequently than non-furries were. So all of this might suggest that furries were dysfunctional, that they have this really wild imagination that could lead them to kind of delusion or getting into trouble. But the research that we have suggests that this isn't the case. So I've actually developed a scale that looks at and distinguishes the difference between healthy fantasy engagement and pathological fantasy engagement. Healthy fantasy engagement is the use of fantasy for things like coping with a bad day, self-expressing as a creative outlet, or just for fun or a way to hang out with other people. And the bars on the left suggest that furries do this much more frequently than non-furries. So furries use a vivid fantasy life as a way of having fun or hanging out with other furries. But when it comes to the pathological side of fantasy, so having delusions, being unable to tell the difference between fantasy and reality, obsessing about things to the point of not going into your job or not being able to pay rent, we find that furries aren't any different from the general population when it comes to these aspects of fantasy. So furries seem to gain the benefits that come about from having a very vivid fantasy life, but they don't seem to have the same detriments that you would expect to accompany a vivid fantasy life. So if we're going to talk about dysfunction, it's worth asking whether furries are more likely to have been diagnosed with a psychological or a medical condition. Maybe that would indicate that there's some kind of dysfunction in the furry fandom. However, we found, in looking at whether or not furries have been diagnosed with anything, that furries were no more likely than the general population to have been diagnosed with a medical disorder, to be on some kind of psychiatric medication, or to have been diagnosed with ADHD, an anxiety disorder, or a mood disorder. In fact, the only condition we've been able to find where furries score higher than the general population is Asperger's, or high-functioning autism. And what we find is, despite the fact that furries score about furries are twice as likely to have been diagnosed with Asperger's in the general population, even after controlling for gender differences, we find that these are still remarkably low rates. We're still talking about less than 5% of the furry fandom. So while this one particular psychological condition may be more prevalent in the furry fandom than the general population, it doesn't seem to be a defining trait of the fandom, because more than 95% of the furry fandom don't have this particular condition. There is research suggesting that furries are more likely to have been bullied than non-furries, and significantly so. In fact, between the ages of 11 and 18, when many teenagers are struggling to answer big questions about themselves, to figure out who they are, and to better understand how the world works, furries were significantly more likely, 62% versus 40%, to have experienced significant bullying. And we're talking about physical harassment, verbal harassment, and a significant amount of it. And this is even after controlling for the fact that furries are also more likely to be gay, something that in and of itself contributes to bullying. So even among gay people, furries are still more likely to be picked on, even if you're a gay furry. The being furry makes you more likely to have been bullied. So it seems to suggest that furries take a significant amount of flack, even in their younger years. And we know from research that being bullied has a slew of negative effects on people. We find quite consistently that people who've been bullied significantly in their younger years are much more likely to have psychological conditions, to be depressed, to be anxious, to have self-esteem problems. We even know that it takes its toll on your body physically. Being continuously stressed as a result of this kind of stigma, this kind of bullying, takes its toll on your immune system. It takes its toll on your heart. It's taxing to a person to constantly be vigilant. So the research suggests that furries ought to be seriously screwed up from having been bullied so much more than the general population in their youth. But that's not what we find. When we look at well-being measures, whether it's self-esteem, subjective well-being, quality of relationships, life satisfaction, how much furries have sort of figured out these big questions about who they are, across all of these, furries don't differ from the general population. It seems to suggest that despite the fact that furries have been bullied and ridiculed significantly, and you would expect them to be lower on all of these measures, they're not. Something is protecting them from having experienced these kinds of detriments that we would expect. And we think that that something is the fandom itself, is having found a place where furries can feel a sense of belongingness and community, where furries can be accepted for who they are. And we've published a number of papers on this subject showing that the fact that furries can be who they are in the fandom and don't have to worry about being picked on, who don't have to worry about hiding who they are, tends to contribute to their well-being. The fact that the fandom provides furries with a social support network. These are people who are around for you when life gets you down, when you're having a bad day and you need to talk to somebody, when your living arrangements are getting really bad and you need someone to drive you, get you out of there. Furries have a really reliable and resilient social support network there to help them out. And the research actually suggests that having a social support network like this is one of the best predictors of well-being, not just for furries, but for people in general. That people who have these social support networks tend to be really well off subjectively. And it seems to suggest that in the furry fandom, this is exactly what's happening. These furries who should be doing poorly are actually doing just fine because they found this community. They've belonged to this group of like-minded others who treat them and take them in for who they are. You might even say that friendship is magic, to throw a My Little Pony themed pun in there. And we can see this even more vividly when we show what happens when you take furries away from the fandom. Many describe going to a furry convention as being this high, this place where they can be themselves for 2 or 3 days and be surrounded by people, surrounded very physically by the community that means so much to them. And what happens when you take that away from people, when furries leave the convention, is for a few days, furries tend to crash. This is the phenomenon known as post-con depression that many furries sort of talk about, and which we've demonstrated empirically using this data here. That in the days following a convention, furries feel more bothered, their mind wanders, they find it hard to focus on their work, they get depressed, everything feels harder to them as a result of being away from this group of people who are this source of social support for them. So I want to finish off this presentation right where we began, with the same question that we started with, this idea of what a furry is, trying to answer what is a furry. And I want to argue that furries aren't crazy people, they're just people. Furries are people who share an interest, and this interest is a defining part of who they are and a defining part of the groups that they choose to hang out with. But in the end, they're people just like anyone else. And this is something that the media tends to miss. When the media talks about what furries are, this is the kind of thing they like to focus on. A bunch of people who put on suits, this crazy gang of fuzzy suit-wearing delinquents, and it misses the point entirely because it focuses on the suits, it focuses on the shallow, skin-deep features, and it completely misses what the furry fandom is really about. In the end, it's about people. People interacting with other people as part of a community. It doesn't really matter in the end what they're hanging out and talking about. It doesn't matter what the content is. What's more important, what's psychologically more interesting, is the connections in the community that are formed as a result of hanging out because of the shared interest. And that's what particularly interests myself and the other members of the International Anthropomorhpic Research Project. It's why psychologists ought to care, and do care, about what we're learning from the furry fandom. And it's why we're going to continue to study furries, whether we're doing so at Texas Furry Fiesta, in Oklahoma, at Anthrocon in Pittsburgh, wherever we go, we're going to continue studying furries because this is so interesting to us. It can help us to understand not only more about the furry fandom, but about what makes people tick, and helps us to better understand the kinds of factors that can make people better in the long run. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. And if you have any further questions, I invite you to go to our research website, furryresearch.com, where you can find all of the data that you see here, and you can get in touch with the researchers themselves and ask us questions about the data that we've presented here, ask us questions about other data, or suggest ideas for future research. Thank you very much.